Hey, AP Worlders, Mrs. Mathers here, coming to you to talk about the Americas. And this is a picture I took actually in St. Kitts of a monkey that was there. He's actually chewing on a piece of sugarcane, which of course is one of the crops that I've told you will change the world. Really one of the most important crops in the world to affect world history. These monkeys were brought over from West Africa, and as it turns out, they really liked the Caribbean, especially St. Kitts, and they are everywhere. And they're actually a little bit scary. I'm not going to lie. They can be a little scary at times. So what we're going to talk about today is, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because, as you probably know, we are having a little bit of a snow half day. So we're looking at the New World, both in Americas and Oceania. First of all, who is in the New World? So the people who basically conquered the New World were actually called conquistadors. The conquistadors were known really for being pretty pretty brutal. The idea of like human rights or even the humanity of the very people that lived in the areas that they conquered wasn't really something that they thought about a whole lot. So the Spanish and the Portuguese were the primary players in Meso and South America, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. They took land, they claimed land for Spain or for Portugal, and they took in the native people as slaves as well. Now, in this very lovely picture here of Cortes meeting Montezuma, we see here a very dapper-looking Cortes. We see Montezuma almost looking sort of like almost like a beautiful land. Everything is just gorgeous, civilized. There's a pyramid here, and this picture is meant to just portray like, oh, there's this friendly meeting of a conquistador and of the leader of the Aztec people at the time. But the Spaniards, nevertheless, Cortes and his men actually do defeat Montezuma. He was killed, and the Aztecs in 1521. Now, the natives help the Spanish, and why would they do that? Think about the Aztecs. Think about the fact that they had human sacrifices, that the people surrounding them would owe tribute. So why would they help? Well, maybe they thought that Cortes would be a better option than Montezuma at the time. There's a woman, and you can read about her in your textbook. Those are the incorrect textbook pages, by the way. But she was critical to Cortes's success. She had Cortes's child. And she was a translator. She knew actually a few languages, including picked up Spanish pretty well, and was able to translate and provide messaging services to Montezuma and to Cortes himself. But what really won the Aztecs over to Cortes and the Spanish was the fact that smallpox decimated their population. Half of Tenochtitlan was killed within a half year of the Spanish arrival, and it weakened the empire to the extent that it was beaten and conquered by only 500 Spanish soldiers. And from there, things started to look a whole lot different. Now, in Peru, we have a little bit of a different story. We have a man named Pizarro who lands in Peru. And there he meets Atahualpa. Atahualpa was one of the leaders at the time. Now, in the Inca realm, there was conflict within the ruling house. There were a few people vying for power. And whenever this situation happens, you see that people can come in and take advantage of that. The natives in the area resented the Incan overlords. They resented the taxes they had to pay for all the roads and the maintenance of the Inca lifestyle. And so Pizarro called a conference with the rulers, and when he was there, he demanded gold. He kept Atahualpa as a prisoner, takes the gold, melts the gold down. I mean, really, the treasures that, the artistic treasures that were lost at that time cannot be even estimated or measured. And eventually, he would kill Atahualpa by garroting him to death. That was a technique that involved putting a rope or a wire around someone's neck and gradually tightening it until they suffocated. So that was Atahualpa's somewhat unceremonious departure from this earth, and then Pizarro would take over. So, how did the Spanish rule in these new colonies? First of all, we had viceroys. Viceroys are the king's representatives. So, what they're going to do is they're going to work for the best interest of the king in Spain. But it was a challenge. So, what they held were something called audiencias. They would have court proceedings. Um, to review the viceroy's decisions, and then these would be reported to the Spanish monarch and to see if they're in line with the interests of the king in Spain. So these proceedings might be about how the new territories, the new acquisitions of land are being ruled, whether or not natives should wear clothing, or whether how much food they should be given, how much they should work. However, the monarch is not going to have a lot of power in this situation because there is such a delay. It's 3 to 4 weeks to get the message to the monarch, 3 to 4 weeks to get a message back. So the viceroys really had to make a lot of decisions on their own while trying to keep in mind the interests of the king in Spain. And then we have the missionaries. In this picture here, we have a missionary. You can see he is holding a crucifix. It looks as though the natives here are worshiping the missionary. Now, I will say that, missionaries were an important part of the conquest of the Americas. They were working on behalf of the Roman Catholic Church. We don't have Protestant missionaries at this time. And Latin America will end up being actually really adapting and embracing Catholicism and making it a syncretic faith in some ways as well. They're concerned with salvation. Okay, this is what the missionaries were there for. They weren't there to conquer land. They weren't there necessarily to respect the Indians. They were there to convert them to Christianity. It helped when the Roman Catholic Church determined the Indians were indeed actually human. This occurred around 1550, and this might seem like a rather obvious thing. Of course, they're humans. Look at their DNA. Well, we didn't have DNA back then, and in a lot of places around the world, people were discussing the fact, well, what is human? And so, humans communicate. They use language. They have culture. They have emotions. They take care of their young. They have a moral code of some kind. And so as colonizers from Europe were going around the world and seeing people that live very, very differently from them, this actually was a question that was up for debate. Are they human, or are they some kind of animal? And like I said, it seems ridiculous now to us to think of them any differently, of not them, but humans any differently than as humans. But it was a point of debate. Then we have the Indian defenders. These people often came to the New World, maybe as an encomienda master. I'll talk about that in a second. Maybe as a missionary, maybe even as a conquistador. But they ended up becoming passionate defenders of the dignity of Indians and Indian rights. They saw the morality, they saw the humanity in the Indians. De las Casas is the most well-known. He was a former encomienda master, which means he had a group of people, humans, that were given to him to do as he pleased and to work for him. But he ended up coming to really love and respect the Indians that were there. And I'm calling them Indians, by the way, because that's what they were called at that time. Now, the Treaty of Tordesillas occurred in 1494, and this was an agreement between Spain and Portugal on how to divide the map. Crazy, right? They didn't even have longitude lines at this time, but they sort of estimated. And so, as you can see on this map, we have Portuguese. They get the east, so they're going to get Brazil, and they're going to get Africa, and they're going to get part of Indonesia here. Now, what does that mean, get? That means that if they go to an area that is unsettled, does not have a pre-existing like European colony, they are free to set up a colony there. The primary colonies that they will have that will be really, really, really important in world history will be here in Brazil, where they'll make sugar, and here in West Africa, sub-Saharan West Africa, where they will get most of their slaves. And the slave trade will become enormous. It's hard to describe how huge it will be, but I remember my African history teacher telling me if you emptied out the Atlantic Ocean, you would see a line of bones from here to hear of all of the people that died merely on the passage from Africa to the New World. So west of the line, the Spanish are going to be able to occupy this territory and these territories, provided that they are not already occupied. Now, you'll see a lot of Spanish influence in, of course, Florida and in Mesoamerica and in Texas. After the mid 1500s, the Portuguese will dominate this area with sugar plantations and slavery will flourish. There is technically no slavery on the Spanish side, but as we'll see, that wasn't necessarily the case. The encomienda system was a really important engine of the economy of the New World. So conquistadors who went to the Americas were awarded natives for forced labor. Keep in mind, it's forced labor. This was something given to them, but the natives had no choice in it. Basically, the natives would give clothing and be given clothing and basic welfare needs. You got to feed them if they're going to work for you. You got to keep them alive, right? They were encouraged to convert to Christianity. This means that they regularly had missionaries come visit them or were required to attend services. And many actually did convert to Christianity, combining them with some syncretic faith. There were rampant abuses in the encomienda system, as you can imagine, from 1520 to 1540. People that did not take care of the natives, they did also succumb to the smallpox epidemic, and gradually this was replaced by debt peonage. So peasants, whether they were of European or of American descent, would have to take out loans for seed and tools, and they would farm the land. They would give much of it back to the encomienda masters and provide cheap labor, and they would be in debt to the encomienda masters because they had no money and no way to buy the loans and the seed, or the seed and the tools, and so they paid them back with labor. Now, the haciendas look very, very much like this. If you've traveled to Mexico, you have probably seen a hacienda. The hacienda is sort of the estate. They were very European looking in origin. So we have the main house right here. All of these little places here might either be places for people to live. I've seen one of these before, and oftentimes they're just small rooms, like with a bed or with bunk beds. But people rent them out now. Like now, some haciendas are actually used sort of like a vacation spot, to be honest. Here we have an area where the horses would work out. We probably have horse stalls in here. And then the surrounding area, of course, would grow crops that are compatible with the region that they were in. Now, I cannot emphasize enough how important silver became to the people of the New World. So in Mexico, in northern Mexico, we have the Zacatecas. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. If I spoke Spanish, I might say it right. And the Andes had the Potosi mines. Now, let me try to describe what these are. These are literal mountains that shimmer with silver. And so the mining was extremely difficult. Now, in Mexico, we did have professional miners. In the Potosi mines, they used the Midas system, which is a leftover from the Incas. And so they gave 1/7 of the male population for 4 months of hard labor. Now, eventually they would learn to extract the pure silver using mercury. Mercury was actually very dangerous and hazardous, still is. Remember, Shang Shi Huangdi thought mercury was the elixir of life, when really it's the elixir of death. So many die in this, in the mining of silver. Again, it was in a mountain. These are not underground mines, they are above ground mines. 1/5 of the silver was sent to the Spanish monarch, where it would pay for the army and bureaucrats in Spain, and the rest of it would go to the conquistadors and the miners and other Spanish people of European descent that lived in the area. Now, the sugar mills, these were Portuguese. These were called engenhos, and they were in Brazil. This is a picture of a sugar mill. So the way that sugar is harvested is very it's very intense. In Florida, when I was working there, there were sugar plantations, of course, not slave operated, but oftentimes operated by illegal immigrants. And so a truck would go through the neighborhood and pick up people who would be paid cash at the end of the day. But it was very intense work. The cutting was difficult, and then they had to boil down the sugar. And so many African slaves were brought specifically to Brazil for the sugar plantations. About 5 to 10% of African slaves died per year. And this is because of the harsh conditions, the fires that were used to burn. Some of the children walked into the fires or fell into the fires. It was very, very dangerous. So the saying goes, 1 ton of sugar equals 1 life. So every ton of sugar costs a slave or cost a life, and that's kind of hard to believe, but that is how the conditions were and how difficult they were. In North America, we're going to have more settler cultivators. Of course, these will include indentured servants, people who take a loan for their passageway to the Americas, and then the Europeans let them work their way off. Of course, we have slave trading in North America, just as they do in the Caribbean and South America. However, the slaves in North America, we'll talk more about these later, they were allowed to have families. There were more women slaves in North America that worked as house servants, whereas in Meso and South America, you're going to see most of the slaves as men, and they would just replace them. In North America, the 2 biggest crops are going to be tobacco. So there's lots of tobacco in Virginia and the Carolinas. When you get into the deep South, like Alabama, Louisiana, you're going to see cotton. Actually, having driven through Alabama, when the cotton it just sort of explodes from its pod, and it's really, really quite beautiful. Also, again, difficult work. Anytime you're working in that kind of heat and the kinds of conditions and hours that they worked, it was very, very difficult. In the Spanish colonies, Europeans dominated politics, economic, and religious affairs. The interesting thing is, when we talk about syncretic religions, the Virgin of Guadalupe, in other words, the Virgin Mary, appeared to a peasant named Juan Diego in 1531. And the site of this vision that he had has become a source of pilgrimage. But the patron saint of the Americas is now the Virgin of Guadalupe. And if you go into churches in, let's say, I went to a church in California, and there was the Virgin of Guadalupe painting was there. I've seen this in many Catholic churches in the Americas, and so on December 12th they do celebrate the appearance of the Virgin Mary to Juan Diego. So Mexican Christianity was mixed with local religious tradition. We see other things like Day of the Dead, falling close to All Saints Day, and so as with most of the world, we're going to have the syncretic faith. Now, the Spanish tried to recreate European society in the cities, but they associated with or had relationships with native women outside cities. This would include marriage, by the way. Spanish and Portuguese colonies were ethnically mixed. They were called Mestizo because the Iberian, meaning people coming from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, were mostly men. Men, as it turns out, want to get married, they want to have children, and they do. I want to keep this in one video, so I'm briefly going to go through the caste system. I'm going to ask you to pause and take a look at this poster. So this is a social stratification system based on something called miscegenation. Miscegenation is the mixing of races. It actually used to be illegal in North America for a white person to marry a person of color. This did not happen in Brazil, and in fact, the system, though, was codified that put people with more white or European ancestry at the top, and those with more mixed African or Indian ancestry lower to the bottom. If you look closely at this poster, I'm going to go really quickly through these so you can pause through them if you want. So here we have the Mestizo. This is an Iberian man who is married to a native woman. They have children that are part European, part native. The mulatto. Mulatto is an Iberian man who is married to an African woman, and their child then would be considered mulatto. That's where that phrase comes from. In a Mersco, so this system is so codified. A Mersco would be a mulatto. So you see the woman here is a mulatto. She was born to an Iberian and African, and then she marries a Spanish person, and their child is Mersco. Okay, it's a little more white than what she was. And then you have the Coyote. This is a mestizo, someone who's of mixed race, the man here in this case, who is married to an Indian woman, and their child would be a Coyote. We have the Lobo, which is either an African and Indian or a mulatto and Indian. Their offspring would be considered Lobo. So it's a complicated system. Eventually, it would break down, and we would have, first of all, peninsulares, native Europeans from the Iberian Peninsula. They will be white. We have creoles. These are people born in the Americas, but their parents are both of European descent. And then we have the mestizos, which end up actually making up most of Latin American society. They're of mixed race. Race relations in North America, a little bit different. We have the French coming into Canada and North America at first. The fur traders oftentimes who were French, and they married Indian women, and their children were called metis. So the metis were the mixed race children of the fur traders and the Indian women. French there in the French cities, however, in Canada, especially if we look on eastern Canada, there are few natives or few liaisons with native peoples. And actually, my daughter, who worked in Canada, have many Canadian relatives, they are really just starting to come to terms with the way that they treated Native American populations, or what they call First Nations people in North America. So I think in the English people primarily settling in North America thought of the natives as lazy heathens. They thought of the African slaves as inferior. There were clear racial boundaries. You did not, for the most part, mix with anyone. English people did not have relations for the most part with people of Native or African descent. And of course they did. And of course there were sexual assaults and things like that as well. In your English classes, I believe that you will learn about the boarding school system that took in North America, both in Canada and the United States, took Native children, brought them to boarding homes, boarding schools, shaved their hair, made them wear Western clothing, and then therefore they became really separated from their cultures. In Canada recently, there was a mass burial found of something like 200 graves of children that were from in Canadian boarding schools. As far as Australia and the Pacific Islands go, we have a first sighting by Dutch sailors in 1606. Captain James Cook lands in the Pacific Islands in 1770. He actually gets killed in the Pacific Islands in a conflict with Pacific Islanders. But anyways, he determines that it was suitable for convicts to inhabit with the Aborigines, and therefore convicts are sent to Australia and the Pacific Islands. And then the Pacific Islands will become important ports for the Manila Galleons. So I'm going to end there. I know this is a really long screencast, but if we look at the Americas here, this is where we're going to see silver. We have Dutch possessions in blue, Spanish possessions in orange. The route of the Manila Galleons is they would come across here. They would refuel in the islands here. They would go back through this way. Sometimes they would try to land in Japan. That wasn't always well regarded. And the Chinese would actually end up coming over to the islands to get silver. Silver was the one thing, and then later on opium, that the Chinese wanted. Everyone wanted Chinese stuff. They wanted silk, they wanted porcelain, they wanted jade, but the Chinese wanted silver, and we'll see how important that is later on. Thanks for paying attention, and have a great day. Take care. Bye.